It was late September of 2017, and I had just turned 34. I had been living in Leeds for the past 6 years, but needed to get out of the city for a while. I had been through a rough breakup in the summer. We had been together for 3 years, and things fell apart fast. After weeks of not eating right and barely sleeping, I decided I needed space. Not the kind you get by sitting in a park with headphones on. I needed real quiet. No phone signals, no neighbors. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just a quick message to my brother saying I'd be off-grid for a few days. Nothing dramatic. Just that I needed some time in the countryside. I found a listing online. An old cabin near a woodland area outside a village called Chillingham, up in Northumberland. The pictures were simple. A single-story wooden cabin with a little porch, sat deep in the woods. No modern touches. The listing said there was a wood stove, running cold water from a tank, and solar power for one light. It was the kind of place I figured I'd either love or absolutely regret going to. I booked it for 5 nights. The drive up took around 3.5 hours. It was gray most of the way, and the sky looked heavier the closer I got to the village. By the time I reached Chillingham, it was nearly 6 in the evening, and the sun was already slipping down. The directions were handwritten by the owner and included landmarks instead of street signs. Turn left after the fallen tree, right at the stone wall with moss on top, that sort of thing. I followed them closely, and eventually found the narrow dirt path leading up into the woods. The track was uneven and covered in damp leaves. My car didn't like it and the tires struggled, but I got up there. I parked on a patch of flattened earth next to a pile of chopped logs. The cabin stood ahead, quiet and alone, wrapped by trees on 3 sides. It looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks, maybe months. A few windows, all dark. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up. The door opened with a solid push. Inside, it smelled like dry wood, ash, and something faintly earthy. Moss maybe, or old water. The place was small. A single main room with a wood stove in the corner, a chair, a small table, and a narrow bed tucked against the far wall. A tiny side room held a compost toilet. There was a jug and bowl for washing, and a mirror nailed up above it.
No fridge, no cooker, no radio.
Just a single solar-powered lamp hanging from a hook in the middle of the ceiling. I had brought a camping stove and a cooler with food, along with a big water container just in case the water tank had issues. That first evening, I unpacked slowly and tried to settle. I lit a fire in the stove and made some tea on the camping stove. Outside, I could hear the rustling of wind through leaves and the slow creaking of trees as they shifted slightly with the breeze. It was peaceful. I read for a while by the dim lamp, then turned it off and lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling until I eventually fell asleep. The second day was just walking. The woods were deep, and I spent hours exploring the trails. There were broken stone walls hidden under ivy, small footpaths barely visible unless you looked closely, and the occasional sign of deer or foxes. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I didn't see a single person all day. I loved it, but something changed that night. I was sitting on the porch around 9:30, just drinking the last of my tea and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was almost totally dark except for a bit of moonlight slipping through the trees. I thought I saw something move further out. Just a flicker, maybe a shadow shifting. I stared for a bit but saw nothing else. I went inside and locked the door, not out of fear, just habit. Later that night, sometime after midnight, I woke up with a strange feeling. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. There was no sound. The woods were completely silent. I sat up and looked toward the window above the bed. The glass had fogged slightly from the inside. I wiped it with my sleeve. Nothing outside, just trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. On the third day, I noticed something odd. I had left the cabin mid-morning, planning to follow a trail I hadn't gone down yet. I walked for maybe an hour, had a small lunch near a stream, and came back around 3 in the afternoon. When I returned, the door was closed but slightly misaligned. I knew I had shut it properly. I even remembered locking it. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the lamp was turned slightly, like someone had brushed past it. The blanket on the bed looked like it had shifted. I stood still for a while, just staring. I checked every corner of the cabin, then stepped outside and walked around it. Nothing. No footprints, though the ground was hard with dry pine needles, so it wasn't like they'd show clearly anyway. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the door hadn't been shut right. Maybe I bumped the lamp and forgot. Maybe I was just wound up from being alone. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing soft noises, like movement, not close, but just far enough that I couldn't be sure what it was. Sometimes it was like someone stepping on twigs. Sometimes it was nothing, just silence and then a sudden creak, like a branch shifting. I kept the fire going longer that night, just for the comfort of it. The fourth morning was colder. Mist clung to the trees and the clearing outside the cabin looked pale and damp. I had planned to hike again, but decided to stay close instead. I gathered more firewood, cleaned the cabin a bit, read, and sat outside when the mist lifted. That's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the treeline, maybe 30 meters away. A woman, middle-aged or older, with long, tangled hair that looked dark and stringy. She wore something long. Could have been a dress or coat, I couldn't tell. It hung loose, almost like a nightgown. She didn't move, just stood still, half-shadowed by the trees. I stared. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. Who was she? What was she doing here? There were no other cabins nearby. No reason for anyone to be wandering this deep in the woods. She just kept standing there, not looking around, not moving. I stood up and walked slowly toward the edge of the porch. She stepped back, disappearing behind the trees. I walked a little closer to where she had been. Nothing. No sign of her. No sound. I waited, looked around, called out, but only with a simple hello into the air, not even loudly. Still nothing. The rest of that day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept looking into the woods, expecting her to appear again. She didn't. That night, I made sure everything was locked. I stacked some firewood against the inside of the door just to hear it fall if someone pushed it open. I barely slept. Every small noise felt louder. Something brushed the outside wall at some point. Twice. Softly, like someone running their hand along it. I sat up in bed for hours, my chest tight, just waiting. The final morning, I made up my mind to leave early. I hadn't planned to cut my stay short, but I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. Something felt wrong. I packed up quickly and loaded the car. I did one last check of the cabin and stepped out onto the porch. And then I saw her again. This time she was closer, maybe 10 meters away, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her clothes looked damp, hanging off her like wet rags. Her face was pale and hollow, eyes dark under the shadow of her brow. Her hair looked matted. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. I stared back for a second too long. Then I got in the car and drove. The dirt track was rougher than before. My tires skidded on the damp leaves. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see her anymore. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I pulled into a lay-by and sat there for a while, breathing, checking my phone. Finally back in range. I messaged my brother, told him I was heading home early. I didn't explain. I never found out who she was. I tried searching online later. Missing persons, local news, anything, but found nothing. The cabin listing vanished a few weeks later. The whole site where I found it shut down that winter. I didn't tell many people about it. A few friends, eventually. They all asked the same thing, why didn't I report it? But I didn't know what I'd report. She didn't do anything. Didn't approach me, didn't threaten me, just stared. Still, there was something in her eyes I can't forget. Something empty, cold. I don't think she lived out there. I think she watched that cabin, watched me. I haven't gone back to the woods since. In the summer of 2016, I was 29 and working as a general contractor up in northern Idaho. I'd been on jobs like this before, remote sites, long days, mostly solo work. But this one felt different from the start. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to some doctor out of Seattle who wanted a quiet place for fishing and writing. I was hired to finish the inside, install cabinets, lay flooring, do the electrical hookups, that kind of thing. The site was a 3-hour drive from the nearest decent-sized town. I drove up in my old Chevy Silverado, packed with everything I'd need for a few weeks: tools, food, propane, some clothes, and a cot. I planned to stay at the site, sleep inside the cabin once it was dried in, and get the job done fast. No hotels out there anyway, just forest, mountains, and a rough gravel road that felt more like a trail the last 5 miles in. The property was tucked between thick lodgepole pines, just off a slope overlooking a shallow valley. No cell service. The nearest neighbor, from what I could tell, was a hunting shack about 2 miles off to the south. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my generator, got the solar hooked in, and powered my battery bank. I'd done jobs this isolated before, and honestly, I liked the quiet. No one bugging you. Just wake up, work, eat, and sleep. By the end of the first week, I had the interior framed, insulation in, and had just started laying the tongue and groove flooring. I'd sleep a few hours at night, usually with a rifle leaning against the wall and a flashlight close by. Not because I expected trouble, but just habit. You see tracks out there: bears, elk, coyotes, but nothing too close to the cabin. I always kept the site clean, burned trash in a pit about 50 yards away, and hung food in a barrel strung up between 2 trees. I first noticed something off around the 10th day. I'd gotten up early to finish wiring the kitchen area and noticed a few fresh boot prints in the dirt just outside the front porch. At first, I figured they were mine, but they didn't line up with the pattern from my boots. I checked twice. These were different, slightly smaller, narrow tread. Looked like hiking boots, and whoever it was had walked up close to the door, then back toward the tree line on the west side. I didn't panic. Maybe it was a hunter or a surveyor passing through. Still, it made me alert. I walked the perimeter that afternoon, didn't see anything else out of place. Left a few markers, little piles of rocks and branches at key spots. It wasn't high-tech security, but if anyone came through, I'd know. That night, I slept light. Woke up once around 2 a.m. and listened to the woods. Total silence. That bothered me more than anything. Usually, you hear owls wind through the branches, the occasional scurry of something in the underbrush, but it was just nothing. I stayed put for a few more days, kept working, but I carried my rifle on me at all times now, even just stepping out to take a leak. I kept the generator off at night, didn't want the noise or the light drawing attention. Used candles or my headlamp inside. Then things escalated. It was the 16th day when I came back from the trash pit and found the cabin door open. It wasn't busted in, just slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I'd locked it with the latch and deadbolt. I always did. It was habit. I walked in slow, rifle up, every step measured. Nothing inside was missing, but something was off. A few of my tools were moved, stacked differently, shifted just enough to make me doubt myself. One of my shirts was missing too. I know because I only brought 5. I checked every corner, attic, crawl space. Nothing. Just empty air and that sick feeling in your chest that tells you something's not right. That night, I sat in the dark with my rifle, looking out the narrow window slats. Around midnight, I heard a twig snap near the back of the cabin, then silence, then another one closer. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, just listened. Whoever it was didn't try to get in. No footsteps running away. No flashlight. Nothing. Just a long, drawn-out wait until the woods felt quiet again. I must have dozed off for an hour before the sun came up, but when I stepped outside that morning, I saw the same boot prints again, clear in the soft earth. This time they circled the cabin, and they were joined by another set. Larger, heavier tread, different person. I packed up that day. Not everything, just enough to get out fast if I had to. I left the tools, locked everything down as best I could, and drove my truck down into the valley where I could catch a faint bar of cell signal. I called the property owner, told him someone might be messing around up there. He said he'd notify the sheriff's office in Bonners Ferry, but they were short-staffed. He told me if I felt unsafe, I could bail on the job. But I needed the money, and I didn't want to leave a half-done project on my record. So I went back. This time, I moved the truck about 200 yards from the cabin and covered it with a tarp. I didn't want it visible from the tree line. I set up a motion sensor I had left over from another job, ran it off a spare battery bank. Only had one sensor, but I set it up by the door and wired it to a buzzer inside. 3 nights later, the buzzer went off at 3:14 a.m. I didn't turn on a light, just grabbed the rifle, crept to the window, and waited. Heard slow footsteps just outside the wall. 1 set, then 2, then silence. I didn't see anything. They didn't knock, didn't try the door, just stood there. I could feel them. I stayed like that, crouched in the dark, for almost 2 hours before I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I found a small pile of rocks on the porch, perfectly stacked, 5 high, like a marker, the kind of thing you'd see on a trail or at a campsite. I swept it away, burned it in the fire pit, and didn't sleep the next night at all. Just waited. I kept working during the day. I was determined to finish, but I never turned on the generator again. Ate cold food, drank warm water, listened, watched. I started setting up more markers, tiny twigs laid across paths, little stones along the trail. They were always disturbed by morning. I didn't see them again, not directly, but I knew they were there. Once, I found a set of prints leading straight up to my cot inside the cabin, and then back out again. No forced entry, no broken latch, just prints. It was like they had keys or they knew the lock. I finished the job on the 29th day. Didn't even tell the owner. Just packed everything, locked the cabin from the inside, then climbed out the back window, sealed it, and hiked to the truck. Drove nonstop all the way back to Spokane. Didn't look back once. About a month later, I got a call from the guy who owned the cabin. He asked if I had left some markings on the trees or stacked stones around the porch. I said no. He sounded uneasy, said he found his front door wide open when he arrived. Nothing stolen, but his dog wouldn't go inside. Just stood there barking at the open door, tail between its legs. He stayed 1 night, then left. Said he'd get someone to check the place out eventually, but not right away. I haven't been back to that part of Idaho since. Whatever was going on out there wasn't about theft or vandalism. They didn't want the cabin. They didn't want me dead. They just wanted me out, and they got what they wanted. I still think about it sometimes. When I'm out on a job in the middle of nowhere, or I see fresh tracks near my gear, or I hear silence that lasts just a little too long. I sleep light. I check locks twice. I don't do solo cabin builds anymore. Not unless there's a team or at least one more guy with me. I lost some income over it, sure, but I sleep better that way. That cabin's still out there, probably finished now, probably locked up tight. But I'd bet money that if you stayed out there alone for more than a week, you'd hear them too. And next time, they might not just stand outside. I don't talk about 2016 much. I was 34 then, single, no kids, no real roots anywhere. I'd just gotten laid off from a company I worked for 6 years. Some tech support job in Birmingham. Not that exciting. I had a bit of money saved, but I was drifting. It was late August when I saw an ad online from a man named Harry, a name I'd later find out wasn't real, offering cheap rent for someone to maintain a piece of land and stay out of trouble. Said it was out near a place called Little Delbury in Shropshire. I'd never heard of it. Most people hadn't. The rent was almost nothing. Just 50 quid a month and a promise to mow the grass, clear out the brush, and make sure no one messed with the fences. It didn't say anything else. I figured I'd take it. I was in that kind of mindset. I needed quiet, I needed cheap, and I needed to be alone. I replied to the listing, we exchanged a few emails, he never gave a phone number, and I got directions to a cabin just north of the village, right next to what he called a family cemetery. That should have been a red flag. It wasn't. The directions were vague and old-fashioned, like something from a letter written in the 1960s. No postcode, just a series of turns and references to landmarks, left at the big oak with a sign nailed to it, right past the rusted tractor, third gate on your left. That sort of thing. It took me almost 2 hours to find it once I got off the main road. When I did, I saw a gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, covered in ivy and bent in the middle. Past it, down a narrow dirt track, was the cabin. It was small, with slats on the outside, slate roof with moss all over it. The front door leaned slightly, and 2 cracked windows faced the track. Behind it, a small shed and then open land, overgrown and wild, leading to a short stone wall that wrapped around maybe 2 acres. Inside the wall were crooked headstones, dozens of them. Some had fallen. Some were barely sticking out of the ground. It wasn't what I pictured when I thought of a cemetery. It looked forgotten. I moved in the same day. Didn't even meet Harry. The key was under a stone by the door, just like he said. Inside the cabin, there was no electricity, no running water. Just a fireplace, a cot with a moldy mattress, a wooden chair, and a table that had 3 legs and 1 short stick nailed in as a 4th. I had a gas stove in my car, some cans of food, a few clothes, and a solar light. That was enough for now. The first week was calm. I spent my mornings clearing brambles off the fence and burning dead branches in a pit behind the shed. Afternoons I'd sit in a plastic chair I found, drinking instant coffee and watching the light shift over the cemetery. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears.
No birds, no planes overhead.
Just the wind through the grass and the creak of the trees. The graves went way back. The oldest one I could read was from 1834. The names were hard to make out. Moss covered most of them. Some were child-sized. I didn't like that, but I told myself it was just part of history. The whole place had that feel like it had been sealed off from time. There was no phone signal, no internet. I was cut off. By the second week, I noticed small things out of place. I'd find my tools moved. Once, the machete I used to cut back thorn bushes was leaning against the shed instead of the cabin wall where I always left it. Another time, I found boot prints near the fire pit. I hadn't worn boots that day, just trainers. I figured it was animals or maybe someone curious from the village, but I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. Then one morning, I woke up to find the cabin door wide open. I always locked it. It was habit. I didn't want some fox or badger getting in. But it wasn't just open, it was propped. A stone had been wedged under the door like someone didn't want it to shut again. Nothing was missing, but my bag had been moved. I knew it had. The zip was open, and my torch was on the table instead of in the side pocket. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door, listening. There was nothing out there. Nothing but the sound of the wind against the side of the cabin. I searched the trees for signs of someone hiding but saw nothing. I didn't have a gun, just a long knife I'd brought for cutting thick branches. I kept it on me after that. 3 days later, I found a grave I hadn't noticed before. It was right against the far wall, behind a patch of stinging nettles. The stone had no name, just a date, 2006. The ground was soft around it, like it had been turned more recently than the others. I didn't dig, obviously, but I knelt and looked around. The wall beside it was broken. Beyond that was nothing but forest. That night, I heard someone walking outside. I'd been lying in bed with the knife next to me. The fire had gone out. It was around 2 a.m., dead quiet, when I heard the crunch of dead leaves. One step, then another, slow, measured, came up to the side of the cabin, near the window. I held my breath. My heart was slamming in my chest. I sat up slowly, careful not to make the bed creak. The steps moved to the door. They stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then I heard a low sound like breathing, but not from a person standing. It sounded lower, like someone crouched right against the doorframe. And then the handle moved. It didn't rattle like someone trying to break in. Turned slowly, quietly, like whoever was out there didn't want me to know. But I'd locked it. I know I had. The handle turned all the way down, then held there, and then released. The footsteps moved away, slowly. One step, pause, another. I waited until sunrise to open the door. There were boot prints in the dirt again, same kind as before. Deep, heavy, like the person weighed a lot or carried something. That morning, I walked the entire edge of the cemetery. The fence was intact on 3 sides, but near the 2006 grave, where the wall had broken, there was a narrow path leading into the woods, barely visible. Not a trail exactly, but something had moved through it recently. I followed it a few yards, found broken twigs and a length of orange string tied to a tree. I didn't go further. Back at the cabin, I packed my things. I was ready to leave, but when I got to the car, the front left tire was flat. Not just flat, slashed. 2 cuts along the side, deep enough to ruin it. I had no spare, just a patch kit that wouldn't help. I stayed another night because I had no choice. That night, I built a fire big enough to light up the whole area. I sat outside with the knife on my lap and waited. I didn't plan to sleep. I didn't. Just past 1 a.m., I saw movement at the edge of the cemetery. It was low, crouched. A man, I think, dressed in dark clothes. He was just standing there, watching me from behind one of the taller headstones. I stood up slowly, didn't move toward him, just stood there. The fire cracked behind me. I blinked, and he was gone. I circled the cemetery with my torch. Found nothing.
No prints.
No sound. Next morning, I hiked 5 miles back to the road. Got a signal near the village and called for a tow. Took them 6 hours to arrive. The man who drove the truck was in his 60s, didn't talk much. When I told him where I'd come from, he gave me a look. "That cabin near the old graves?" he said. I nodded. "You're not the first," he said. He didn't say anything else the whole drive back. I never heard from Harry again. His email stopped working. I searched for the cabin's location online but found nothing. No mention of a family plot. No rental records. Nothing. It was like it didn't exist. 3 months later, I got a brown envelope in the post. No return address. Inside was a photo, black and white. Looked like it had been taken in the 90s. Showed a group of people standing by the graveyard fence. One of them looked like the man I saw behind the headstone. On the back was written, "You stayed longer than the others." That was it. I moved to Bristol. Got a job fixing office printers. Kept to myself. Still do. I don't go into the countryside anymore. Don't hike. Don't camp. And I never rent places from strangers online. Sometimes, I still dream of the graveyard. But more often, I wake up and check my doors, check the windows and make sure no one is outside. No one's ever there, but I still check. Every night. The rain had been pouring since late afternoon, a steady downpour that blurred the edges of the world around me. The cabin I was building wasn't much, just a simple structure with wooden walls and a roof that sloped a bit more than I intended. But I didn't mind. It was mine, or it would be once it was finished. The place I'd chosen was isolated, tucked away in the hills about an hour's drive from the nearest town. There were no neighbors for miles, just thick trees, wildflowers, and the occasional rustle in the brush that always made me double-check the knife I kept at my side. I had worked construction for years, but something about building this cabin felt different. It wasn't just the isolation, though that certainly played its part. It was the way the wind howled through the trees like a distant voice and how the rain seemed to make everything feel alive in a way that was unsettling. I had a few supplies left to go before I could call it a day, but the storm was getting worse, and it made sense to settle in for the night. I took one last look at the walls, mostly framed with only the roof and a few finishing touches left, and sighed. There was a small fire burning in the stone pit I'd made earlier, and I couldn't wait to sit by it with a hot meal and a drink. But as I made my way toward the fire, a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't anything specific. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just an unsettling sense that something wasn't quite right. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the silence of the woods and the rain battering against the trees. Still, there was something in the back of my mind that whispered, "Stay alert." I grabbed my flashlight from the table by the cabin's half-built doorway, shining it out into the trees. The beam barely pierced the thick darkness beyond the cabin, but everything seemed normal, just wet leaves, soaked bark, and shadows moving with the wind. I shook my head, telling myself to focus on the task at hand. The cabin would be done soon enough. As I stirred the fire, the rain started to pick up again, becoming even heavier than before. It was strange. It wasn't the usual soft drizzle that came with autumn. This was thick, almost oppressive. The kind of rain that flooded the earth and soaked you to the bone the moment you stepped outside. I crouched down, stoking the fire, and glanced back at the cabin. The wind was pushing the rain sideways, so the shelter would offer no real protection from the elements. I considered my options. I could just hunker down for the night inside the half-built cabin and try to sleep. But I had no bed, no blankets, nothing but the hard wooden floor and the makeshift walls. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual sound of branches swaying under the rain. It was a distinct crack, like someone had stepped on something too close to the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, my hand on the knife strapped to my side. The world outside was still. The wind howled in the trees, but no other sounds followed. I waited a few more minutes, just standing there, staring out into the rain. Nothing moved, but the uneasy feeling that had been nagging me all evening grew stronger. It wasn't until I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the dread, that I heard it again. A soft shuffling sound, just beyond the reach of the light. My heart rate picked up. My eyes darted to the edge of the cabin, where the woods met the clearing. I was alone. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of nowhere, and anyone wandering too close to my cabin would have to be either lost or curious. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't a random animal or a deer foraging for food. The movement was deliberate. I got up again, slowly this time, taking the knife from its sheath. I crept toward the door, cracked it open just enough to slip outside. I shouldn't have. The wind seemed to howl louder as soon as I stepped out, almost deafening. The rain pummeled my face and hands, and the night had gone pitch black, the trees looming like dark giants. I had no choice but to squint through the downpour, shining the beam of the flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam of light illuminated a pair of eyes staring back at me from the trees. I blinked hard, thinking I was seeing things. But no, there they were, Two glinting, unblinking eyes peering out from the shadows, not too far away. For a split second, the world felt still again. I stood frozen, staring at those eyes, unsure of what to do. But then the figure moved. A quick, fluid movement, too quick for a person. It darted behind a tree, just out of view. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive, as if the whole forest had drawn a deep breath and was waiting. I didn't think twice. I ran back inside the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knife clanged against the floor as I set it down, trying to calm myself. But I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. I knew what I had seen. What I didn't know was who or what it was. The rain didn't stop. It rained harder, if anything, and the wind continued to batter the sides of the cabin. Hours passed. The only sound was the relentless beating of the rain. I should have gone to sleep. I should have rested, but I couldn't. The thought of that figure, the movement, the eyes, it all replayed over and over again in my mind. I started to hear faint sounds outside again. Footsteps, shuffling in the wet leaves. They were slow this time, deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't in a rush. It was studying me, waiting for something. I couldn't stay inside forever. I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight and the knife again, opening the door just enough to slip outside. The cold rain drenched me instantly, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was figuring out what was out there. I walked out, slowly at first, the light from my flashlight cutting through the rain and darkness. I scanned the trees again, looking for any sign of movement. There, a figure standing motionless under a large oak tree, its back to me. I stopped, staring. It wasn't human. It didn't have the shape of a person. It was tall, too tall, and the way it stood was unnatural, like it was contorting itself to blend in with the environment. It had long limbs, twisted and thin, and the clothes it wore hung from it loosely, as though they didn't belong. The air grew even heavier. My throat tightened. I stepped back, barely able to keep my legs under me. Then the figure turned. Slowly, deliberately. It had no face. The realization hit me like a slap. There was no face, just smooth, featureless skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I could see nothing but the pale reflection of the flashlight's beam bouncing off it, but it didn't seem to notice or care. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was frozen, trapped by a primal instinct that told me to run, to flee, but I couldn't. The figure tilted its head, like it was studying me now. Then, without warning, it began to walk away, moving into the trees, its legs bending and twisting in ways that defied reason. I didn't wait around to watch it go. I turned and ran back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night there, too scared to leave, too scared to sleep. When the rain finally stopped the next morning, the world outside seemed different. It felt like I had crossed some line, one that could never be uncrossed. But the figure was gone, for now. I finished the cabin in the days that followed. It was just a structure, a place to sleep, to rest, to survive. But I never felt the same about that land. I never looked at the trees the same way again. Some things are better left unknown. Some things are better left unseen. And as I looked out at the woods, I realized that some parts of nature will always hold secrets you weren't meant to find. But at least I had finished the cabin. At least I was safe, for now. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked like a safe haven, a secluded escape from the world. I had just moved into the area, away from the noise of city life, a fresh start. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. It was a perfect place to settle in, calm down, and find some peace after everything that happened. I thought the solitude would help me sort out my life, I'd been driving for hours, the only sound being the hum of my tires on the empty, winding road. The trees blurred by the windows, the occasional flash of sunlight breaking through the canopy, casting a warm glow onto the dirt road. I was in my late 30s, still young, but with a lot of baggage. Divorce, career burnout, 1,000 unfinished projects. The cabin was supposed to be a break from all of that, place to reset. It was a small, 2-story log cabin. Nothing special on the outside, just logs, stacked up and weathered from years of exposure to the elements. The roof had patches where shingles were missing, but it looked livable, maybe even charming. I'd seen pictures online before making the long drive, but photos can lie, can't they? The cabin had a rough around the edges feel to it. The porch creaked as I stepped out of my truck, and I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, pine-scented air. The silence was almost deafening, but it was the kind of quiet I had longed for.
No honking horns.
No crowded streets, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It had been a long day, so I didn't bother unpacking. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, sat in an old rocking chair by the window, and let the slow fall of dusk take over the cabin. The trees outside shifted gently as the wind picked up, and I tried to unwind, focusing on the calm. The first night in the cabin was uneventful. There were no strange noises, no eerie feelings in the air, just the normal creaks and groans of a house settling. I slept soundly, the kind of sleep you only get when you're in a place you feel safe, away from the pressure of the outside world. The second day, things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, a sense of something not quite right. I had explored a bit, taken in the nearby woods and the lake a few miles away. The town was small, quiet, with just a few shops and houses, so I didn't expect much interaction. But by midday, I noticed the air felt colder. It wasn't a drastic change, just a sharp drop that had me wrapping my jacket around me a little tighter. I checked the back door, making sure it was locked. I'm not paranoid, but there's something about being so far away from civilization that gives you a strange sense of awareness. The trees seemed thicker somehow, the shadows longer. I told myself I was just imagining things and went back inside. But as the sun dipped lower, I started hearing noises, subtle creaks from upstairs, like someone walking in the old wooden floors. I brushed it off. The cabin had been unoccupied for years before I moved in. It was probably just the wood expanding and contracting with the temperature. I wasn't worried, at least not yet. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises became more distinct. Soft footfalls, someone moving in the upstairs bedroom. I sat up, heart hammering. My eyes darted around the room. The moonlight spilled through the cracks in the blinds, illuminating the old furniture and the dust motes dancing in the air. There was no one up there. I was sure of it. I had checked every corner of the cabin when I first arrived. Yet the sounds continued. This wasn't my imagination. Something was moving upstairs. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and cautiously opened the door, making my way upstairs. The old floorboards creaked under my weight. Each step felt louder than the last, as if the house itself were trying to tell me to turn back. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. The hallway was empty, bathed in the same eerie moonlight. There were no signs of anything out of place. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The sound of my own breath was the only thing that filled the space. I turned around and made my way back to my room. I kept the light on that night, unwilling to let the shadows take over again. The next day, I decided to do some maintenance. Check the pipes, sweep up the dust, clear out some of the old furniture in the attic. It was a chore, but it kept me busy. The last thing I wanted was to sit around and let my mind wander to the strange things I had heard the night before. By noon, I was upstairs, rummaging through some old boxes in the attic. The place had a musty smell, like it hadn't been touched in years. I opened one box after another, sorting through old books and dusty knickknacks. That's when I found it. A small metal box, hidden behind a stack of old newspapers. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom of the box. I stared at it for a moment before deciding to open it. Inside was a bundle of old photographs, some letters, and a small, yellowed piece of paper that had been folded multiple times. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was old, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. They don't leave this place. No matter what you do, they don't leave. I shuddered. Who had written this? And why had it been tucked away like this, hidden in a box no one had bothered to touch for decades? My thoughts began to race. Who had lived here before me? Why did the cabin feel so off? I set the paper aside and continued sifting through the box. That's when I saw it. Something that made my blood run cold. A photograph, a black and white photo of the cabin, taken from the same spot I had stood just a day earlier, looking out across the porch. But there was something wrong with it. In the photo, the cabin was intact, well kept. But behind it, a figure stood just inside the trees, hidden partially by the shadows. I stared at it for a long time, but the figure wasn't clear. It was blurry, almost like a distortion. I stuffed the photo back into the box, a sense of unease creeping into my mind. Maybe it was nothing, a trick of the camera. Or maybe it was just someone passing through, trying to get a glimpse of the place. But the more I thought about it, the more the feeling lingered. There was something about this cabin I didn't understand. That night, as I settled into bed, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The noises upstairs returned, and they were louder now, more deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the stairs again. As I stepped into the hall, a sudden cold breeze brushed against my face. The air felt different now, heavy, thick with an unsettling chill. I turned on the light at the top of the stairs, casting long shadows down the hallway. I had no idea what I was expecting to find, but the feeling in my gut told me it wouldn't be good. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the closed door at the end, the door to the room where I had never dared go, the door that had always seemed to whisper to me, to draw me in. The door creaked as I pushed it open. My heart pounded in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see a faint outline of something lying on the floor. I aimed the flashlight toward it. There, sprawled out on the floor, was a body, a lifeless, pale figure, lying in a pool of blood. Its eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. My stomach lurched. The sight of it was enough to make me stumble backward, almost falling over in my panic. The body was decomposed, far more than I would have expected for someone who had just died. The smell hit me next, a rancid, rotten stench that made me gag. I backed away, my breath short, my pulse racing. I didn't know who this person was or how they ended up here. I didn't know why the body was left in that room, a place I had avoided. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Someone had died here, and that someone had been left behind. I stumbled out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind spiraling out of control. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I had to get help. The air in the cabin felt thick now, suffocating. My legs shook as I fumbled with my phone, desperately trying to dial 911. But as I turned back to look at the body one last time, something caught my eye. The door. It had been ajar when I left, but now it was closed. Slowly, I walked back toward it, and as I reached for the handle, I knew I wasn't alone. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to head up north for a week to stay in my cousin's old hunting cabin. He hadn't used it in years, and I'd asked if I could borrow it for some time away. I was 34 then, between jobs, newly single, and just wanted to be left alone for a while. I thought it'd be good to spend some quiet time with my dog, Jasper, a 6-year-old black lab mix who was more loyal than most people I knew. The cabin was about 45 minutes outside of Ironwood, Michigan. It sat just off an old logging road in the woods near Lake Superior, surrounded by thick trees and empty forest. It wasn't the kind of place people stumbled across. If you didn't know where to turn, you'd never find it. I loaded up the truck with a week's worth of food, my sleeping bag, a heavy coat, some books, and a generator in case I needed power. I brought Jasper's food, his old blanket, and some extra gear just in case. I'd been camping all my life, but this wasn't just a weekend thing. I planned to stay for 7 full days. It was already cold up there. Not snowing yet, but you could smell it in the air. Cold enough at night that you needed layers even inside. The drive up was uneventful, just a slow climb into the quiet woods. Cell signal dropped about 10 miles out. After that, it was just me, Jasper, and the trees. When I got to the cabin, everything looked exactly how I remembered it from years ago. Just a one-room wood building with a tin roof, a small wood stove, and a rickety porch out front. It wasn't fancy, but it held warmth well enough, and the roof didn't leak. There was a shed out back that held chopped firewood, a rusted axe, and an old aluminum boat flipped upside down.
No plumbing, no installation.
Just a place to disappear. I got to work right away unpacking, getting the stove going, and checking around the place for any signs of animals or squatters. Nothing. The lock on the door still worked, and aside from a few squirrel droppings in the corner, the place was as I left it last time. Jasper sniffed every inch, tail wagging like crazy. He loved the woods, loved it more than anything. The first day passed slow and quiet. I went for a short hike with Jasper down to the river a few miles out. The trees were nearly bare, and the sky stayed gray most of the time. I didn't see another soul, not even a plane overhead. At night, I read by lantern light and let the wood stove crackle us to sleep. Jasper curled up by my feet like always. He was warm, alive, and real. That was enough. The second day, I chopped some firewood, made a simple breakfast, and took Jasper out to explore the trail past the ridge behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, but I remembered it from years ago. It followed the edge of a dried-out creek bed and eventually looped back around to a logging path. We went slow. I had a .22 rifle slung over my shoulder, not for hunting, but for bears or coyotes if needed. About halfway through that hike, I saw something that made me stop. Just off the path, maybe 30 feet back, there was a tree with fresh marks in the bark. Deep ones, not made by an axe. Claw marks. 3 thick gouges down the trunk about chest high. I put my hand to them. They were fresh. Jasper sniffed the air and lowered his head. Could have been a bear. Could have been nothing. I told myself it didn't matter, but something about it felt wrong. Bears don't usually get that close to cabins, especially with all the smell of people and dogs around. Still, I didn't let it bother me. I didn't want it to bother me. That night, something woke me up. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustle outside, like leaves dragging across the porch. Jasper sat up before I did, ears up, nose twitching. He didn't bark, but he stared at the door with that stiff, focused posture dogs get when they're watching something. I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped to the window. I didn't turn the light on. I just looked. Nothing but dark trees and the faint outline of the porch in the moonlight. I listened for a while but heard nothing else. Eventually, I crawled back into the sleeping bag. Jasper didn't settle for another hour. The next morning, I found footprints. Not boots, bare feet. Human maybe, but not normal. The prints were wide and short with thick toes and a weird arch. They started just past the porch and led off into the woods toward the old logging road. I followed them for about 30 feet before they vanished in the leaves. They didn't make sense. Too big to be a child, too messed up to be shoes. My chest got tight just looking at them. Jasper growled once, low in his throat. Then we went back to the cabin. I didn't hike that day. I chopped more wood, cleaned the cabin, and stayed close. I made chili in a pot on the stove and kept the rifle within reach. Jasper didn't leave the porch, not even to pee. He just laid there, watching the woods, ears flicking back and forth like he was trying to catch something I couldn't hear. That night, it came back. I didn't see it. I heard it. Footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy ones. The wood creaked under its weight. Jasper went stiff again, but didn't bark. Just stared. I had the rifle beside me and the flashlight ready. I didn't move. I just laid there and listened as it passed by the window, stopped at the door, and then turned around.
No knock.
No sound. Just breathing. I swear I heard it breathing. In the morning, I found more footprints, this time clearer. The toes were splayed out like someone who hadn't worn shoes in years. One print had what looked like a scar or missing toe. It had stood right at the door. Just stood there. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was being stupid. Probably a homeless guy or some mountain drifter. Maybe even just a weird bear. I'd locked the door. I had a gun. Jasper was with me. I stayed. The 5th day, I left a trap. I rigged up some fishing line across the porch with a few empty cans tied to it. Just enough that if anything walked through, it would make noise. I figured I'd scare it off or at least get a look at whatever it was. That night, the trap worked. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the cans crash to the floor outside. Jasper bolted up, barking for the first time. I grabbed the flashlight and threw the door open. Nothing. The line was snapped. The cans were scattered. No sign of anything. Just woods, darkness, and silence. I scanned the trees with the light, but it barely reached past the porch. I felt something watching me, not just fear, something sharp and cold right in my gut. I backed inside and locked the door. The next morning, the prints were all around the cabin, not just near the porch. They were by the windows, by the back wall, and near the shed. It had walked in circles around me all night. I packed up that morning. I'd had enough. I stuffed everything into the truck, loaded up Jasper, and tried to start the engine. Dead. The battery wasn't just low, it was gone. Completely drained. It made no sense. I'd started it the day before to warm up. No lights had been left on. It was just dead. The nearest town was a long walk, at least 10 miles. I could have gone on foot, but I didn't trust leaving the cabin with Jasper alone, and I sure didn't want to be caught out in the woods after dark with whatever was out there. So I stayed. One more night, I barricaded the door, pushed the table and chairs in front of it, made sure the rifle was loaded, and sat up with Jasper in my lap. I didn't even try to sleep. Just past midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't alone. 2 sets of footsteps, slow, dragging, one heavy, one lighter, quicker. They circled the cabin, tapped the walls. I heard something breathing just outside the window again. Jasper didn't bark. He whined, tail tucked, and crawled closer to me. I'd never seen him like that before. And then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath. It was silent for what felt like an hour. Then something scraped against the wood. A long, slow scrape like nails or claws down the siding. Circled once more, then was gone. The next morning, there were no prints.
No marks.
Nothing. Just frost on the grass and a sky turning gray. But the truck started. I didn't question it. I grabbed everything, didn't even check the shed. I threw it all in the bed and we left. I didn't look back. I drove straight to town and got a motel for the night. I slept with the lights on. A few days later, I called my cousin, asked him if he'd ever had weird stuff happen at the cabin. He said no. He hadn't been up there in over a decade. I didn't tell him what happened. Didn't feel like he'd believe me. I never went back. That was almost 8 years ago now. I still have Jasper. He's older, slower, but he's still with me. He doesn't like the woods anymore. I don't either. I don't know what it was. Person, maybe. Something else. I don't think it matters. What matters is I trusted my dog when he said something was wrong. I listened. I left. And because of that, I'm still here. My name is Ryan Clark. I'm 34 years old now, but this happened when I was 28. I haven't told many people about it. Not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, but because saying it out loud makes me feel like I'm right back there. Smelling the pine sap, hearing the cracking of dry leaves, seeing the man's short, stiff, black hair silhouetted in the twilight. Back in 2019, I lived in a small town called Meaford, tucked against the Georgian Bay shoreline in Ontario, Canada. I worked construction, and I was always hunting for side jobs. Most of the time, they were boring, patching drywall, pouring driveways, redoing roofing in the heat. But one of my crew, an older guy named Leo, told me about a client who wanted a full glass cabin built way out in the woods near Magnetawan. Remote spot, miles from anything. No proper road even. I liked the sound of it. Pay was good, and the guy who owned the land had apparently gone and cleared it all himself. No trees, just flat bedrock and tall grass. He already had the materials shipped in massive tempered glass panels, steel frames, everything. All he needed was someone to put it together. It was late September when I first drove out there. The sky had that muted gray tone, the kind it gets when autumn is starting to settle in and summer is just a memory. I remember thinking the trees looked too quiet. Still green, but too quiet. The road was gravel for the last 10 kilometers, then just stopped at the edge of the forest. The rest of the way I had to hike in, hauling tools on my back like a mule. The sight was surreal. It looked like someone had dropped a modern architect's wet dream in the middle of untouched forest. There were no other structures, no power lines, no signs of anything except a roughly cleared rectangular area with stacks of glass leaned against metal braces, all wrapped in weatherproof sheeting. The glass was high-grade stuff, at least 10 feet tall, maybe 6 feet wide. There was a portable toilet tucked behind some pine shrubs and a large steel shipping container where the materials had been stored. No cabin yet, no foundations poured. Just the pieces and me. I didn't meet the guy right away, the man who owned the place. He wasn't there the first day. I worked alone, setting up temporary supports and mapping the frame layout. It was silent. No birds, no bugs, nothing but the wind creaking through the canopy. I stayed overnight in my truck parked near the trailhead and hiked back in the next morning with a pack of supplies and my tent. That was the plan. I'd camp on site for the next few weeks and finish the job. Simple. Second day, I met him. He walked in from the trees in the morning. No sound. Just appeared behind me while I was adjusting a support beam. I turned and there he was, maybe 6 feet tall, stocky but not fat, wearing a long gray jacket and heavy boots that looked like military issue. His hair was short, so short it looked like black sand glued to his scalp. His face was pale, very pale. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me and circled the site slowly, watching. I thought maybe he was shy or weird, or maybe just rich and antisocial. Whatever, I didn't care. I was there to work, not make friends. He came every day after that. Never spoke, never helped, just stood near the edge of the trees and watched. Always silent, always in the same coat, even when the weather was warm. I asked Leo about it once over the phone. He said the guy had money and wanted privacy, and that I should just do the job and get out. So I did. The glass frame went up fast. I worked long hours, pushing myself because I knew the weather was going to turn soon. October in northern Ontario isn't forgiving. Once the nights hit freezing, working with metal gets dangerous. I didn't want to be out there when frost turned the place into a death trap. The cabin was designed to be simple but stunning. One large room, all glass walls and ceiling, with a steel floor elevated slightly off the bedrock by welded posts. The panels had to be maneuvered with care, and the ceiling system was complex. But it was beautiful. When the sunlight hit the panels, they shimmered, reflecting the sky and forest like a mirror. But it didn't feel beautiful. It felt wrong, like the glass didn't belong there, like the trees hated it. And I started noticing things, small things at first. My tent was moved 6 inches one morning, just enough that I could tell. My tool belt was hanging upside down one afternoon when I was sure I'd left it lying flat. The guy with the short hair never said anything, just stood there, like a scarecrow with blood in his veins, still, watching. Sometimes I'd catch him looking up into the trees instead of at me, like he was listening for something. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I started hearing noises at night. It started with clicks, not animal sounds, not wind, sharp clicks, like a tongue snapping against the roof of a mouth, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always near my tent, never far. I kept a hatchet with me. I started sleeping with it in my hand. Then the clicking turned into scraping, like fingernails dragging along canvas. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was already halfway through the job. I told myself I was just tired, that I needed the money. One night I heard breathing, not mine, heavy breathing outside the tent, just standing there a few feet away. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling. Then the breathing again. I didn't sleep after that, just laid there, eyes wide open, listening. The man with the short hair was never there at night, only during the day. I started wondering where he stayed. I never saw a car, never saw a tent, nothing. Then I found the hole. It was about 100 yards from the cabin site, behind a wall of thick cedar bushes. A shallow depression at first glance, but when I cleared the debris away, it was a hole, perfectly square, about 3 feet wide, maybe 5 feet deep, lined with stone. There were claw marks on the inside walls, long ones, like something had tried to climb out. No ladder, no tools nearby, just the hole. I didn't tell anyone about it. I should have, but I didn't. That night, I moved my tent closer to the shipping container. It had a steel door that could be locked from the inside. I figured I'd sleep there from now on, and I did. For the next 3 nights, I didn't hear anything. No clicks, no breathing, no footsteps, until the 4th night. The door rattled at exactly 3:17 a.m., not a gentle shake. It slammed 3 times. Boom, 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 then silence. I waited, holding my breath, gripping my hatchet like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I didn't sleep. I watched the sun rise through the little vent window. When it got light enough, I stepped outside. Footprints, bare footprints, in the frost, leading away from the container and back toward the trees. But that day, the man didn't show up. I finished the structure by the end of that week. It stood there like a monument to wrongness, clean, sleek, and completely out of place, like something meant to lure people in. The man returned the next day, watched from the trees, nodded once when I packed up my gear and started hauling it back down the trail. No payment, no thanks, no words, just that same nod. I got back to Meaford the next evening and called Leo, told him the job was done. He said the guy had already paid in full. I didn't go back, not for months, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the hole, the noises, the glass walls that showed everything but somehow felt like they hid more than they revealed. In late April, I decided to go back. I don't know why. Curiosity, guilt, something. I told myself I just wanted to see the cabin finished and standing in the spring light. I told no one where I was going. Just drove up alone, same route, same trailhead. But when I got there, everything was wrong. The clearing was overgrown, as if no one had stepped foot there in months. The grass was waist high, The path I'd carved through the brush was gone. The cabin was still there. The glass was intact, but the inside was destroyed. Furniture overturned. Steel floor rusted with streaks of something dark and dry. And the glass, every panel on the inside was covered with handprints. Thousands of them. Some small, some large, all from the inside. And the hole was deeper, much deeper, at least 20 feet now. Still square, still lined with stone. And this time there were bones at the bottom. Piles of them, clean, picked dry, and a coat, a gray coat like the one the man had worn. Torn, shredded, hanging on a root like someone had tried to claw their way out and failed. I backed away slowly, got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was home. I told no one, not Leo, not the cops, no one. I quit construction 2 months later, started working in a hardware store. Less money, but I sleep better now. I don't know what happened out there, but that cabin was never meant for living. It was meant for watching, for trapping, for containing something. And the man with the short hair, he wasn't the owner. He was just the first one it caught. It was the summer of 2013. I was 26, single, and just between jobs. I'd been living in Manchester, doing night shifts at a warehouse, but I was burnt out and tired. I quit with a bit of savings stacked away and no real plan ahead. My mum's older brother, Martin, had a small farm in Wales near a place called Langerig. Remote area, lots of woods, miles away from anything resembling a town. He wasn't farming it anymore, but he still kept the land, a few outbuildings, and a small cabin he'd built years ago when he first bought the place. My mum called me one day and said Martin could use a hand fixing a few things out there, broken fences, overgrown trails, clearing the barn, that sort of thing, and in return I could stay in the cabin rent-free for the summer. It sounded like a decent trade. I figured I could use the quiet to clear my head, maybe get in shape, and enjoy some fresh air after years of city life. So, in early June, I packed a bag, took a slow train out, and then Martin picked me up in an old blue pickup at the station. We barely spoke on the drive. He was one of those men who believed in saying less and doing more. He dropped me at the cabin, handed me a set of keys, pointed at the tool shed and the barn, and drove off with a wave. Said he'd check in at the end of the week. The cabin was about 500 yards from the main road, hidden behind a thick row of trees. It was small, wooden, one-story, tin roof, no insulation, but solidly built. It had a little front porch with 2 sagging chairs and a view over the tall grass and treeline. Inside was a bed, an old gas heater, a table, a few shelves, and a kitchenette that ran on propane. No Wi-Fi, no signal unless you hiked up to the edge of the property. That first night, I sat on the porch watching the wind push the grass around, and I thought, yeah, this might actually be good. I spent the first few days doing basic cleanup. The trail from the cabin to the barn was mostly grown over, so I cut that back with a machete Martin left for me. The fences on the west side of the land had been knocked flat, probably by storms or animals, so I started collecting the pieces to rebuild it. The barn itself was full of old junk, rusted tools, stacked crates, and piles of hay that hadn't been touched in years. I didn't mind the work, kept me busy, and there was something calming about sweating in the sun and seeing real progress. But even early on, something about the place didn't sit right. Not in an obvious way. It wasn't creepy at first, just quiet. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. I'd be out there raking brush or sorting timber and realize I hadn't heard a single bird for hours. No crows, no wind, nothing. Just the crunch of my boots and the rasp of branches. It made my skin crawl sometimes, and I couldn't explain why. At night it was worse. The cabin creaked like old wood does, but I kept hearing sounds that didn't fit. Scraping outside the walls, Heavy, short thumps. A few times I heard what sounded like someone shifting weight on the porch, like a boot scuffing the wooden boards. I'd grab the flashlight and look out, but there was nothing, just the same field and tree-line, still as ever. Around the second week, I found the trail. I was clearing brush about 30 yards behind the barn, near a thick patch of trees, when I saw something strange. A narrow footpath, half hidden, pressed into the grass. It wasn't a game trail, too straight, too defined. It cut off sharply into the trees and vanished into the woods. I hadn't seen it before, and Martin never mentioned anything about it. I figured maybe he'd used it years back to get to a creek or something. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed it. The trail wound through the trees for about 10 minutes. It got narrower the deeper I went, and the woods got thicker, darker. I started to think I'd made a mistake when it opened up into a small clearing. Right in the middle was what looked like an old shed, but calling it a shed didn't feel right. It was more like a shack. The roof had caved in on one side, the walls were rotted and warped, and one of the doors hung loose on a rusted hinge. It looked abandoned for decades. I stepped closer and caught a whiff of something foul. Not death exactly, but old rot, like wet wood and mildew and something else. I poked my head in and saw busted crates, a few piles of clothes, and a rusted camping stove. In the corner was a stained mattress and a pile of what looked like bones. Small ones, maybe animal. I didn't look too close. The whole place gave off a bad feeling, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I backed out and left quick. I didn't tell Martin about it when he came by that weekend. I don't know why. Maybe I thought he already knew about it and didn't want it disturbed. Or maybe I just didn't want to sound like I was spooked by some rotten shed. He helped me fix the fencing and said he'd be back in a few weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the bones, the mattress, the smell. Around midnight, I heard something walking around outside again. This time it was different. Slow, steady footsteps, crunching grass. I turned off the lamp, crouched by the window, and peeked out. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just beyond the tall grass, I spotted a shape moving. A man, I think. Not running, not sneaking, just walking. Tall, thin, in dark clothes. He didn't look toward the cabin. He just walked the edge of the field, then disappeared into the trees near where I'd found the trail. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited until morning and hiked up to the spot I'd seen him enter. I found the trail again. Same narrow path, same thick woods. I followed it back to the shack. It looked the same, but this time there were fresh footprints in the dirt. Big ones, boots, and the door I'd seen hanging loose, now it was shut. That changed everything. I started locking the cabin at night, even though the door barely had a proper lock. I kept the machete by the bed. Every night I listened for footsteps, and most nights I heard them. Sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for hours. Once, I swear I heard breathing just outside the wall behind my bed. Slow, deep breaths like someone standing still. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some local squatter using the shack. Maybe a hunter or a drifter. But something about the way they moved, the silence, the timing, it felt off. I kept working during the day, but I started avoiding the trail altogether. A week later, I found something on the porch. It was early morning. I opened the cabin door and stepped outside, and there, on the top step, was a dead rabbit. Gutted, skinned, perfectly laid out. Not chewed or torn up like an animal would do. It was clean, precise. Its eyes had been removed. I froze. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. Eventually, I scooped it up with a shovel and tossed it deep into the brush. I didn't know what else to do. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching at the door. Not loud, just soft, steady dragging sounds, like nails or a stick being run along the wood. It lasted 10 minutes, then stopped. I waited until sunrise before opening the door. There was nothing there, but the wood was marked. Long, thin scratches dragged downward. I decided to leave. I packed a bag, hiked up the hill until I had signal, and called Martin. Told him I was heading back early, didn't give a reason. He didn't ask. I think he knew something was off. I waited in the cabin that day, scared but trying to stay calm. When I stepped out that afternoon to grab water from the rain barrel, I saw someone standing at the treeline. Same spot I'd seen the figure before. He was just standing there, not moving, watching the cabin. I went inside, locked the door, sat with the machete, and didn't move for hours. When I finally looked again, he was gone. Martin picked me up the next morning. I said nothing. Neither did he. Years have passed now. I live in Sheffield, work a regular job, rent a flat. I haven't been back to the cabin. Martin sold the land a year later to some developer, and last I heard, they cleared most of it out to make way for some eco-retreat. They probably tore down the shack. Sometimes I wonder who lived there, if that's what you could call it. I wonder if they're still out there, walking the woods, watching the fields. I've never told anyone the full story, not even my mom, but I'll never forget that summer. The silence, the trail, the breathing, the way I felt watched even when no one was around. And I'll never forget the way the rabbit's body was laid out. Perfect, deliberate, like someone wanted to send a message. I got it. I've never gone near a cabin since. It was October of 2011, and I was 32. I had taken a week off work from my job at a distribution warehouse in West Virginia. I wasn't much of a traveler or hiker, but I needed quiet, away from forklifts and alarms and people coughing up black coffee all morning. My uncle once mentioned an old family-owned cabin he used to visit when he was young, out by Fort Delaney, a now mostly forgotten Civil War site tucked into the hills near the Kentucky border. It hadn't been used in decades, and from the way he talked about it, nobody in the family really cared what happened to it anymore. I figured it was perfect. No tourists, no phone service, no traffic. I borrowed a beat-up old Jeep from my coworker, threw a sleeping bag, some canned food, a water jug, and a basic tool kit into the back, and started the 3-hour drive early in the morning. The directions my uncle gave me were old school, turn by turn on paper with landmarks instead of GPS. He warned me the road might not be drivable all the way up anymore, but I figured I'd hike the last stretch if I had to. The highway turned to back roads, then gravel, and finally what barely passed for a dirt trail, cutting through an endless sprawl of pines and oaks. About a half-mile from where the cabin supposedly stood, the Jeep gave up. The trail was too narrow, too overgrown. I parked it, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. It was colder than I expected. The trees were mostly bare, but some dead leaves still clung on, fluttering like dry paper whenever the wind picked up. The whole place smelled like soil, moss, and distant fire smoke, even though I hadn't seen another soul for hours. Just birds, and not many of them. I found the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the ridgeline. It sat about 30 yards off the trail, partly hidden behind a slope and thick trees. The thing looked like it had sunk into the ground. The porch was warped and leaning, with moss growing out of every crack. The windows were black and empty, the glass long gone. The roof sagged under a blanket of dead leaves, but it was still standing. And to be honest, that was more than I expected. I stepped onto the porch and felt the wood bow under my weight. My boots made almost no sound. It was soft, damp, spongy. I opened the door with a push, creaked like you'd expect, but didn't fall off. Inside was pitch black. I clicked on my flashlight. The inside wasn't huge. One room, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 long, with a narrow hallway leading to what looked like a bathroom or storage closet. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, most of it warped or cracked. There was a fireplace made of stone on the far wall and what used to be a couch under the front window, but it had collapsed in on itself like a rotting carcass. Everything smelled like mildew and animal piss. Still, I was in. I rolled out my sleeping bag in the corner opposite the door, not near the window, and ate a can of beans cold. I didn't bother with a fire. I was too tired. The quiet was absolute. No bugs, no branches creaking, not even wind. It was a dead kind of silence that made you feel like your own breathing was too loud. I remember thinking the whole forest felt abandoned, not just the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because of noise, just the opposite. It was the total stillness. I kept waking up in the dark, convinced I heard something, but each time it was just my own heartbeat or the faint rustle of a mouse in the wall. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something brushing against the outside wall, but when I got up and shined the light through the broken window, nothing moved. Morning didn't make things feel better. It was colder. I got dressed, ate some jerky, and decided to poke around outside. There were no real trails behind the cabin, just patches of flattened brush. I followed a few of them for a bit, hoping to find a stream or an old shed, but all I got was more woods. Around noon, I went back to the cabin and noticed something strange. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, but I know what my boots look like. These were smaller, narrower, almost like old-fashioned shoes. They weren't fresh, more like imprints in the soft dirt under the porch. But they were there. I counted 5 or 6 steps leading from the side of the cabin toward the rear, but then they vanished. I stood there for a while, staring at them. I told myself they were probably old, maybe some hunter or hiker years back. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder the rest of the day. I spent that afternoon trying to reinforce the cabin a little. Stacked a few stones at the base of the fireplace, propped up a board in front of the biggest window hole. I wasn't sure why. I had no plans to stay more than a couple nights, and nobody was coming out here anyway. But it felt better doing something. That night was worse than the first. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I didn't know what time it was. My flashlight was still next to me, but the batteries were low, just a dim beam. I thought I heard footsteps, not close but somewhere outside. Soft crunches like leaves under slow, careful movement. Then a pause, then another crunch, then nothing. My ears strained, trying to cut through the silence. The steps didn't come closer. They didn't repeat, but I was wide awake for hours, staring into the dark, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I got up and walked the whole area around the cabin. I didn't see anything, not one print, nothing disturbed. I wanted to leave then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I was just spooked from being alone. City people aren't used to the stillness, that's all. I opened a can of tuna, chewed it slowly, and sat on the porch with my boots up on the railing, like I was trying to prove something. That was the day I found the cellar. There was a patch of dirt about 15 yards from the cabin where the ground sloped downward in a weird, sunken way. It looked like a shallow crater. I walked over, poked at it with a stick, and the stick clinked on something solid. I brushed away the leaves and loose dirt and found a thick wooden panel. It was nailed shut on all sides and had no handle. I dug around the edges until I found an old iron ring buried in the dirt. Took both hands and a lot of effort, but I managed to pull it open. Beneath was a short flight of stone steps leading into pitch black. The air that came out smelled like old metal and wet earth. I stood there for a while, looking down into the dark, until the wind shifted and I felt something colder than air brush against my face. I shut the panel and walked away. That was the first time I really felt scared. Not the kind of scared where you think something's nearby, but scared of something already there, something you stirred up. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept the flashlight on, batteries be damned, and sat upright in my sleeping bag. Every time a leaf rustled, I jumped. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was the cellar door. I swear it. It was far off, but the sound was clear. A deep wooden creak, not like a tree branch. Heavier, slow, deliberate. I stayed frozen until dawn. I left the next morning. I packed up everything, didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't look at the cellar. I didn't look for prints. I just walked back to the Jeep, half expecting something to be wrong with it. But it started. I drove straight home. A week later, I looked up Fort Delaney online. There wasn't much. A few dusty historical mentions. Tiny battle, nothing major. But I found one article archived from 1973. Some amateur historian had gone looking for a family homestead near the fort and stumbled on a sealed root cellar in the woods. He opened it, found some old tools and clothes, said it looked like someone had lived down there once. The article ended with a quote I haven't forgotten. It wasn't abandoned. It was hidden. I never told my uncle I went. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I remember the feeling of that cold air against my face, the way it moved like it wasn't just wind, and the sound of wood creaking open in the dark. And I always wonder, if I'd opened that cellar door just a little farther, what else might have opened with it? It had been a rough few weeks. Life hadn't been kind to me recently, and the stress of the past year had weighed me down more than I cared to admit. When my old friend Ben invited me to spend a weekend at his cabin in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. I needed a break, somewhere far from the noise of the city, somewhere quiet where I could finally clear my mind. The cabin was located in the remote mountains of West Virginia, a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town. Ben had inherited it from his uncle, who had built it himself in the 1970s. It wasn't much, just a small, rustic log cabin tucked away in a thick patch of forest. The kind of place where no one would think to look for you if you wanted to disappear for a while. I could tell Ben was eager to get away from everything, too. I remember the drive up clearly. The road twisted and turned, narrow and unforgiving. The trees grew thicker the higher we climbed, until it felt like we were driving through a tunnel of green. The air grew cooler, fresher, and the further we went, the more isolated everything became. The world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the dense woods around us. By the time we arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trees. Ben parked his truck in front of the cabin and jumped out, stretching his legs. "Here we are," he said with a grin, as if the cabin had some magical property. I nodded, a little unsure. The place was isolated, which was exactly what I had wanted, but the reality of it hit me as I looked at the small, weathered structure. It wasn't just secluded, it was downright desolate. A rough gravel path led up to the front porch, which was barely big enough for 2 chairs. The wood of the cabin was worn, the logs darkened from years of exposure to the elements. The windows were small and covered with grime, but I could make out the faint outline of a few mismatched pieces of furniture inside. Ben opened the door with a loud creak and waved me in. "Welcome to my little slice of heaven." He dropped his bag by the door, and I followed him inside. The interior was what I expected. Rustic, cluttered, and a little dingy. There was a fireplace on the far wall, stacked with firewood that had clearly seen better days. The furniture consisted of a couple of mismatched chairs, a small wooden table, and an old couch that looked like it had been there longer than I had been alive. The smell of aged wood and the faint scent of pine filled the air. I set my bag down in one of the corners. The place had a charm to it, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Maybe it was the silence. Out here, there was no background hum of traffic, no distant drone of airplanes. It was just us, the cabin, and the vast forest surrounding it. We spent the first evening settling in, chopping firewood, and preparing dinner. The night grew darker quickly, and by the time we sat down to eat, the only light was from the flickering fire. Ben and I talked about old times, catching up on everything that had happened since we last saw each other. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept wandering. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive, like it was waiting for something. It didn't help that the wind outside was picking up, howling through the trees like some kind of warning. After dinner, we decided to take a walk around the property. Ben had said that his uncle used to take long walks in the woods, claiming it helped clear his head. I figured it was as good an idea as any to get a feel for the place, so I grabbed a jacket and we headed outside. The night was cool, the kind of chill that settled into your bones. The wind was strong, rattling the trees and causing branches to creak and sway. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving us in near total darkness. Ben led the way, his boots crunching on the gravel path. We walked for about 20 minutes before Ben stopped suddenly, raising his hand in front of me. "Listen," he said, his voice low. I stopped beside him, straining my ears. At first, I didn't hear anything over the wind. But then, faintly, I caught something. A rustling like someone moving through the underbrush. "Probably an animal," I said, trying to sound casual. Ben didn't seem convinced. "It's too regular," he muttered, "like someone walking." I shrugged it off, even though a small part of me wondered if Ben might be right. There was no one out here for miles, not a soul around for miles in any direction. And yet, that sound kept coming, rhythmic and deliberate. We stood there for a few moments, listening, but whatever it was had stopped. Ben made a face and turned back toward the cabin. I followed him, my mind racing. It was probably nothing, just a deer or some other animal. But the air felt different now, colder, heavier, as if something had changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin's walls had me wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar sounds of the woods. But the unease was still there, gnawing at me, refusing to let me rest. The next day was clear, with a crisp morning breeze that made the trees sway gently. Ben was in good spirits, making breakfast while I sipped my coffee and tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. We decided to explore the forest more during the day, hoping to put whatever it was out of our minds. The woods were beautiful during the day, majestic with towering trees and a canopy that let only small beams of sunlight through. The forest floor was thick with leaves, and every step we took sent a cascade of branches and pine needles tumbling to the ground. Ben showed me a small stream that ran through the property, its water cold and clear. It was peaceful, serene. I could almost forget about the unease from the night before. But then, as we walked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. There were markings on the trees. At first, I thought it was just the natural wear from the environment, but as I looked closer, I realized they were deliberate. Deep gouges like something or someone had scraped at the bark with sharp claws. The marks were too consistent to be random, and they seemed to circle around certain trees, almost as if they were pointing toward something. "Ben," I said, my voice tight, "what are these?" He glanced at the trees and shrugged. "Probably just animals, or maybe some people from the local area marking the trees." "It's nothing." I wasn't so sure. The air had grown heavier again, and the further we walked, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was subtle, but I could sense it. A feeling of eyes on me from somewhere deep in the forest. By the time we returned to the cabin that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling. We spent the rest of the day inside, talking, playing cards, and trying to forget the strange markings and sounds. The night came quickly, and once again, the wind howled through the trees. But this time, the feeling of unease was even stronger. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. That rustling sound. Only this time it was louder, closer. I sat up, heart pounding. My mind raced. Was it just an animal? Or was someone out there? I waited for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, just a faint tap, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the door, trying not to make a sound. The cabin was silent except for the wind. I peered out the window, but there was no one in sight, just the blackness of the night. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound, my heart pounding in my chest. But after a long moment, I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, watching the door, listening to the wind, and waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I told Ben about the knock, but he brushed it off. "You're probably just paranoid. The wind does weird things out here." But I wasn't so sure. Something about that night felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We packed up and left the cabin the next morning, my mind still racing. As we drove away, I looked out at the trees one last time. The woods were silent again, but the markings on the trees still haunted me. I never went back to that cabin. Something in those woods, something unseen, was waiting. I could feel it in my bones. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city. After years of working long hours in an office, the constant ringing of phones, and the endless buzz of emails, I needed a break. Some quiet, a chance to clear my mind. That's why when my friend Dave invited me to his cabin in the woods for a weekend, I jumped at the chance. It sounded perfect. A small getaway in a secluded area, just far enough from civilization to forget about everything for a while. Little did I know that my need for peace would lead me straight into something far darker than I ever could have imagined. Dave's cabin was nestled in a small, quiet valley in the Appalachian Mountains, about 2 hours from the nearest town. He had inherited it from his grandfather, who had built it in the late 60s. The place wasn't big, but it was cozy. Wooden walls, a small kitchen, a stone fireplace that had always smelled of burning pine wood, and a couple of bedrooms upstairs. When I first arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the trees and the clearing around the cabin. The air was fresh, cool, and clean. There was no traffic, no bustling crowds, just the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the distant sound of a stream running through the woods. It felt perfect, like I had stepped into another world. A peaceful, untouched place where nothing could disturb you. Dave was already there when I arrived, sitting on the porch with a beer in his hand. He grinned at me as I got out of the car, greeting me with a big hug. "Glad you could make it," he said. "This place is gonna do wonders for you. It's the best way to get away from it all." I smiled, but there was something about his tone that felt a little off. Not much, just a hint of something I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off, though. I was tired from the drive and excited for a quiet weekend, so I focused on unloading my stuff and getting settled. That evening, we ate a simple dinner of steaks on the grill and talked about everything and nothing. Dave was always the type of guy who liked to talk about the past, the good old days when things were simpler. As the night wore on, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. We moved inside the cabin, stoking the fire in the fireplace to keep warm. I noticed how quiet it was. The cabin felt snug and secure, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The wind outside howled, but there were no other sounds. No animals, no rustling of leaves, nothing. I tried to ignore the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't shake it. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. I took the bedroom upstairs, and Dave stayed downstairs on the couch by the fire. The bed was comfortable, but I couldn't sleep. The quiet gnawed at me. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks and groans of the wood settling, the wind pressing against the windows. At one point, I swore I heard something scratching at the cabin's outer walls, but when I went to the window to check, there was nothing, just darkness and trees stretching out into the unknown. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. The sun had risen, casting a pale light over the landscape. Dave was already in the kitchen, humming as he cooked. "Morning," he greeted me when I walked in. "Sleep well." "Not really," I admitted. It was so quiet. I kept thinking I heard something outside. He chuckled. "That happens. This place can play tricks on your mind. It's so isolated, you get used to hearing things that aren't there." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't like the feeling that had settled over me. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something else. Something I couldn't explain. After breakfast, we decided to go for a hike. The woods around the cabin were dense, the kind of forest where the trees seemed to close in around you, their branches intertwining overhead. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and rocks, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. It was beautiful, but there was a heaviness to it, like the woods were watching us. We hiked for a couple of hours, following a narrow trail that Dave said led to a small clearing with a creek. The silence was deafening. Even the birds had stopped singing, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too still. It was the kind of stillness that made you uneasy, as if the world had paused for a moment, waiting for something to happen. As we reached the clearing, I noticed something strange. A set of fresh footprints in the mud, leading toward the creek. They were large, deeper than they should have been for someone walking casually. Dave noticed them too, and his expression shifted from his usual easygoing demeanor to something more serious. "Those don't look like normal tracks," he said, kneeling down to examine them. "They're too deep, and the direction, they don't seem to make sense." "Who would be out here?" I asked. "We're miles from anywhere." "I don't know," he replied, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees. "But we should head back. The weather's changing, and it's better not to stick around too long." We made our way back to the cabin quickly, but I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. They seemed to follow a pattern almost deliberate, as if someone or something had been tracking us. But there were no signs of a person, no sound of footsteps behind us, nothing. That night, as we sat by the fire, the wind began to howl again, louder than before. It sounded like it was coming from all directions at once, like the entire forest was alive. Dave was quiet, staring into the flames. I tried to push the unease out of my mind, but it was becoming harder. There was something out there, something in the woods, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I got out of bed, moving quietly to the window. There, just beyond the trees, I saw a shadow. It was tall and thin, standing still for a moment before it moved again, disappearing into the darkness. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. There was someone out there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but the signal was spotty, as it always was out here. I turned to Dave, who was still asleep on the couch, unaware of the danger lurking just outside. The footsteps continued, slow and methodical. I felt the urge to hide, to lock myself in the bedroom and wait for morning. But something in me refused to run. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold, the trees swaying in the wind, but everything felt wrong. The silence had returned, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was ominous. I shone the light into the woods, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I heard a twig snap to my left, and I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the crunch of leaves as something moved closer. I backed up slowly, my pulse racing. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it getting closer. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. Just then, I heard Dave's voice behind me. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I spun around, startled, but there was no time to explain. The growl came again, this time closer. Too close. Something big, something fast was charging at us from the trees. I turned and ran, dragging Dave with me as we bolted for the cabin. The door slammed shut behind us, and I locked it with shaking hands. We stood there in the dark, listening. The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy breathing. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we packed up and left. Neither of us said much, but the tension between us was palpable. We didn't need to talk about what had happened. We both knew we'd been followed by something dangerous. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The woods were still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting for the next time we'd return. We didn't speak much on the way back. The cabin, the woods, and whatever had been stalking us would remain there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back. I was 35 the year it happened. It was 2017, and I had just left a job at a landscaping company in North Carolina. Things hadn't gone well for a while. I was behind on rent, scraping by with odd jobs. I didn't have family to lean on and wasn't close to many people anymore. I needed something that paid, didn't ask questions, and gave me a place to sleep. A friend of a guy I knew had a contact up in the Blue Ridge Mountains who needed help fixing up an old hunting cabin. It belonged to some rich man from out of state who wanted to renovate it to rent out to tourists in the summer. The job was simple: basic repairs, painting, clearing brush, replacing floorboards, maybe fixing the roof. I'd stay in the cabin, be left alone, and get a decent paycheck when it was done. 6 to 8 weeks. Winter was setting in, but the pay was better because of that. I drove up there in my old Ford truck, packed with a duffel bag, some tools, a secondhand sleeping bag, a few groceries, and a propane heater. The cabin was about 12 miles off the main road, tucked into a ridge surrounded by pines and cold silence.
No neighbors.
No cell service. The last part of the drive was dirt and gravel, winding along a river that looked half-frozen already. The cabin itself wasn't huge. Just one bedroom, a front room with a fireplace and some furniture, a small kitchen, and a back storage room. It smelled like old wood and mouse droppings when I stepped in. The furniture was dusty. The floor creaked. It looked like no one had lived there for years. There was a small generator in the back shed and a water pump out front that still worked if you primed it right. I cleaned up, aired it out, and started a fire in the old stone fireplace that first night. It was cold, but not unbearable. The first week passed slowly. I repaired a few cracked window panes, cleared snow off the roof, started replacing rotten boards near the back porch. It was quiet, peaceful. There was no one around for miles. Occasionally, I'd hear a distant engine echo through the woods, maybe a snowmobile or someone logging nearby, but it was never close. I didn't see another soul until the end of the second week. That's when I noticed something strange. It was small things at first. One morning, I found fresh boot prints in the snow behind the cabin, near the treeline. Big prints, like from a man's work boots. I hadn't gone back there in 2 days. They weren't mine. I followed them a little way, but they just disappeared into the brush. Another time, I came back from chopping wood and found the front door cracked open. I always latched it when I left, but I told myself maybe I hadn't pulled it all the way shut. I checked the cabin. Nothing looked touched. My stuff was where I left it. Still, I started locking the door from then on, even during the day. The next few days were uneventful, but I felt different. I started waking up in the middle of the night, sweating, thinking I heard footsteps on the porch. Sometimes I thought I saw something move outside when I looked through the windows, but it was always gone when I opened the door and stepped out with a flashlight. Just wind and trees and snow. I tried to shake it off. I focused on the work, but I started noticing more signs. Wood chips under the window, like someone had been trying to pry it open from the outside. My propane heater moved slightly out of place one night. A few food items missing. I couldn't tell if I was going crazy or if someone was sneaking around the cabin when I wasn't looking. One morning, I found a dead bird on the steps. Its neck was broken, and it had been laid there like some kind of offering. It freaked me out more than I wanted to admit. I burned it in the fire pit and stayed inside the rest of the day. On the 24th day, I found something that made my stomach drop. Behind the shed, under a thin layer of snow, I found a sleeping bag. It was old and faded, half frozen, but it had clearly been used recently. There were food wrappers stuffed inside, some empty cans, and a plastic bottle filled with what looked like urine. Whoever it was had been camping just yards from where I slept every night. I took it and burned it all. I wanted to send a message that I knew someone had been there and they weren't welcome. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the axe beside the bed and the flashlight in my hand. The next day, I hiked down the trail to the spot where I could get 1 bar of service and called the guy who had set me up with the job. He brushed it off, said it was probably just a drifter or a hunter passing through. He told me to carry a gun just in case, but I didn't own one. He offered to send someone in a few days if I really wanted, but I didn't want to look weak or lose the job. I said I'd be fine. The days dragged after that. The noises got worse. At night, I'd hear tapping on the walls. Slow, deliberate. Sometimes it sounded like something dragging along the porch. I tried to catch it, but by the time I'd throw on boots and run outside, there'd be nothing. No fresh prints. Nothing but the wind and the cold and the sound of my own breathing. I started keeping a fire going all night. I kept the axe even closer. Then, about a week later, I woke up and felt it immediately. Something was wrong. The cabin was too cold. I checked the fireplace. The fire was still burning low. But the door to the back storage room was open. I never left it open. I barely even went in there. It had old tools, some stacked chairs, and mouse droppings in the corners. But now it was open, and I swear I heard breathing. Not my own. Slow, controlled, close. I grabbed the axe, flicked on the flashlight, and walked slowly toward the door. I was shaking, but I had to check. I kicked the door open and swept the light across the room. Nothing. But the window in that room, the tiny one near the ceiling, was open. It had been nailed shut when I arrived. I didn't sleep that night. I nailed it shut again. Then I barricaded the front door and put heavy chairs against the windows. I felt trapped. Every sound set me off. Every creak felt like footsteps. I thought about hiking down and leaving, but the snow had picked up again, and it would be at least a half-day walk to town through the ridge. I told myself I could last a few more days, get the job done, leave with my money. The next day was when I found the camera. It was tucked up under the eaves of the cabin, almost hidden in shadow. Small, like a game cam, the kind hunters use. I'd walked past it a dozen times without noticing. I climbed up, pulled it down, and checked it. It had a memory card inside. I didn't have a laptop or anything, so I stuffed it in my pocket and took the camera out to the fire pit. I smashed it with the axe and threw the pieces into the flames. But the damage was done. Someone had been watching me. The last night was the worst. It started with the power going out. The generator stopped. I tried to restart it, but it was dead. Someone had cut the fuel line. I knew it wasn't just wear and tear. The hose was sliced clean. I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going. I had my axe, 2 candles, and my flashlight, but the batteries were almost gone. I stayed awake, sitting in the chair near the fireplace, wrapped in the sleeping bag, watching the shadows move. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The back window, glass shattering. I stood, axe in hand, and listened. The storage room. Again, I heard something moving in there. Slow steps on old wood. Breathing. I didn't wait. I moved to the doorway, raised the axe, and stepped in. There was a man standing in the dark. Mid-40s maybe. Beard, dirty clothes, heavy boots. He didn't move when I stepped in. He just stood there, breathing hard, looking at me like I was the intruder. I didn't hesitate. I swung the axe, caught him in the side of the shoulder. He screamed, grabbed at it, and I hit him again, then again. I don't remember how many times. When it was done, he wasn't moving. I collapsed on the floor beside him, breathing harder than I ever had. My hands were shaking. My shirt was soaked in blood that wasn't mine. I sat there until the sky started to turn gray. When morning came, I packed my bag, left the fire burning, and started walking. I didn't look back. I walked all the way to the nearest gas station, called the police, and waited. They found the body. They never found out who he was. He wasn't local. No ID. No missing persons matched him. Just a stranger in the woods with no reason to be there. He'd been living out there a while. They found a tarp shelter down in a ravine, hidden under some branches. He had binoculars, food wrappers, and dozens of pictures of the cabin printed out and pinned to the walls. Pictures of me inside. Pictures of me asleep. They ruled it self-defense. Said I was lucky to survive. Told me it happens more often than people think. Someone disappears into the woods, chooses a cabin, watches it until they decide they want it for themselves. I never went back. The check came in the mail a month later. I didn't cash it. I moved to a different state, got a job in a hardware store. I still wake up some nights and think I hear someone breathing in the room. Still check the windows. Still feel that cold, watching silence. Sometimes I wonder how long he was out there before I noticed. And sometimes I wonder if he was really the only one. I was 38 that fall, divorced for 2 years, and finally getting used to the quiet. I'd moved out of Albuquerque a while after the split, rented a place in Taos for a year, then bought a piece of land a bit north of Chama, up near the Carson National Forest. It had a rough gravel road that wound out to a small, weather-beaten cabin tucked in the middle of about 10 acres of thick pines. I wasn't much of a recluse, but I needed a place to hit reset, and I figured the farther from the city I was, the better. I'd bought the land from an older guy named Tom Barden. He didn't say much during the sale, just wanted to be done with it. Said he hadn't stayed at the cabin in years and was just trying to get rid of it. The paperwork went through easy, and I had the title in hand by mid-September. That same week, I hauled up a couple of loads, tools, dry food, a generator, a cot, some folding chairs, and a few other things. I figured I'd camp out for a couple of weeks at a time and slowly work on fixing the place up. The cabin itself was nothing special. A single room, sagging porch, metal roof rusted through in places. There was an old wood-burning stove in the corner, some built-in shelves that had clearly seen better days, and a half-rotted bunk bed frame bolted into the back wall. The front door didn't lock properly, so I brought up a new deadbolt and planned to replace it once I had the tools laid out. I liked the solitude. The first week, I'd wake up to frost on the windows and birds rustling outside. I'd spend the mornings cutting and stacking wood, the afternoons walking the perimeter of the property, and the evenings sitting out on the porch with a thermos of coffee or whiskey, depending on the mood. I had a little solar battery rig that kept my phone charged, but I only turned it on once every couple of days to check messages or weather updates. About 10 days in, I started noticing strange things. Not the kind of stuff that screams horror movie, just small things easy to write off if you weren't paying attention. The first time was a missing piece of firewood from a stack I'd built the day before. I thought maybe I'd miscounted or a raccoon had knocked it off into the brush. A few days later, I found one of my gloves, left on the porch overnight, lying out near the tree lean, about 30 feet off. No drag marks, no chewed edges, just sitting there like someone had picked it up and dropped it again. Then came the smell. Started one night in early October, just after sunset. I was sitting inside reading, lantern burning low, and I caught a scent like burnt hair and rotting meat. I thought maybe something had died under the cabin or nearby, so I went out with a flashlight, walked all around the place, looked underneath with the light. Nothing. But the smell lingered, faint and nasty, like something had been there a few minutes before I came out. It was cold enough that week that I kept the stove going most of the night. I woke up around 3 a.m. one morning because the fire had died down and the inside of the cabin had gotten cold. I pulled on a jacket and went out for more wood. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not crashing. More like someone trying not to be heard. They came from behind the cabin, from the direction of the old trail that ran off into the woods. I froze. I didn't think it was an animal. It was too steady, too purposeful. I turned off the flashlight and stood still. The sound stopped, too. I waited maybe 2 minutes before turning the light back on and sweeping it toward the trees. Nothing. I circled the cabin, shining the light low to catch prints or movement, but there was nothing out of place. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck didn't settle until I was locked back inside. Stove roaring. The next morning, I checked for tracks. I thought maybe the cold had hardened the ground too much, but I did find something. Deep scuffs in the dirt behind the cabin, about 20 feet out. They weren't prints exactly, but something had definitely been moving there. I told myself it was a deer, maybe just stumbled a bit. But I knew better. Around that time, I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake up 2-3 times, no clear reason. The smell would come back, some nights stronger than others, and I'd hear movement. Not just footsteps, but low thuds, like something dropping from a tree or climbing over the porch railing. One night, I left a folding chair out on the porch by mistake. The next morning, it was gone. Not knocked over, not broken, gone. I looked for an hour in all directions, no sign of it. That's when I got serious about tracking. I set up a few small trail cams I'd used back in my hunting days. Just cheap ones, motion activated, nothing fancy. I pointed them toward the tree lean, the back of the cabin, the trail. Next day, I checked the footage. Nothing. But the day after that, one of the cameras was broken. Snapped clean off the tree, as if someone had grabbed it and twisted it. The tree bark around it was scratched, and the camera itself had been smashed against a rock. That same morning, I found something hanging on the porch railing. A dead rabbit, cleanly gutted, its body split open down the middle.
No bite marks.
No signs of struggle, just placed there. I took a shovel and buried it far out past the trail. I didn't know what else to do. I started keeping a rifle close by, and I slept with it next to the cot. But I never saw anything clearly, just rustling shadows, strange prints that would vanish in the daylight, and that thick, choking smell that would come and go like fog. One night in mid-October, things finally hit a breaking point. I had just put out the lantern and was lying in the dark, eyes half shut, when I heard the porch creak. Not the wind, not an animal. Something heavy stepped right up to the door. I stayed frozen. I could hear slow breathing, like someone standing inches from the wood. I thought about grabbing the rifle, but I didn't want to move. The door didn't open, but something began to scratch it. Light at first, then harder. Not claws, fingernails. scraping down the wood in slow, measured strokes. After maybe a minute, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found scratches on the door, long and straight, like someone had dragged a hand down it. But they weren't human width apart. They were too long, too thin. I made the decision to leave that day. I packed up most of my gear, loaded it into the truck, and drove back to Taos. I stayed at a motel for a few days just to clear my head. I didn't go back to the cabin for over a month. When I finally did, it was to sell the place. But I had to check on it first. Snow had fallen early that year, and the road was half-blocked, but I made it through. The cabin looked worse. Roof caved slightly on one end, windows frosted from the inside. But the strangest part was the smell. It was inside now, thick and greasy, like something had been living there for weeks. I opened the door and immediately gagged. The stove was knocked over, shelves broken, cot torn apart. The walls had marks on them, muddy, oily streaks that looked like handprints but too large and too narrow. And on the back wall, in dark smudges, someone or something had drawn an outline of a person. Not detailed, just a tall, thin shape with long limbs and no face. That was it for me. I didn't pack anything. I turned around and left, drove straight to town, and called a cleanup service to go up and clear the place out. I signed over the property for almost nothing and didn't ask for a receipt. I didn't care. A few months later, I ran into a ranger at a bar in Espanola. We got to talking and I brought up the cabin without the details. Just mentioned I'd stayed out there. He nodded and said, "Lot of weird stories out that way. Old legends. Some say it's skinwalker territory. Locals won't hunt up there after dark." I didn't say anything. Didn't feel the need to. I'd seen enough. Now I live near Durango, Colorado. New place, nothing fancy. I stay close to people. I don't go deep into the woods anymore. I don't camp alone. I don't leave chairs out on porches overnight. And if I ever smell that stench again, burnt hair and meat, I won't look around. I'll just leave. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. But it was real. And it knew I was there. It let me leave once. I'm not testing my luck again. It was a late autumn afternoon when I first noticed something wasn't quite right. I had been a park ranger for just over 5 years, working in the rugged backwoods of the Cascade Range. The air had started to turn colder, and the usual tranquility of the forest was beginning to give off an eerie feeling. The days were shorter, and the trees stood bare against a gray sky that seemed to press down on the earth with an unusual weight. That day, I was assigned to the northern sector, the furthest point of my usual patrol area. It was a part of the park that rarely saw visitors. The dense woods, steep hills, and winding trails made it challenging for most hikers. There was one old ranger cabin up there, a small, dilapidated structure that hadn't been used for years. It had been a long time since anyone had maintained it, but it was still marked on the map as a potential shelter if the weather turned bad or if someone found themselves stranded. I had been to that cabin only once before, during a routine inspection when I was still new to the job. Back then, it felt isolated but peaceful. Now, however, there was something about it that seemed different, almost foreboding. Maybe it was the stillness in the air or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. Either way, I had to make sure it was in good condition, especially as the first snow of the season was approaching. The hike to the cabin was long, but not difficult. I followed the trail that wound through thick pines, my boots crunching through the layer of fallen needles on the ground. As I climbed higher, the trees grew denser, and the wind started picking up. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The cabin finally came into view as I rounded a bend in the trail. It looked exactly as I remembered, small, weathered, with a sagging roof and moss creeping up the sides. The door, which had once been sturdy, was now slightly ajar, swinging on rusty hinges. I felt an odd sense of discomfort as I approached. I knew it was just a cabin, a structure built for function, but the way the door hung there, almost waiting for me, made the place feel like it was holding its breath, as if it had been waiting for someone to come back. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should even go inside. It wasn't like I was afraid of being in the woods alone. I'd spent countless nights out there, camping or working, but something about this place gave me pause. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp wood, musty air, and something faintly metallic. It was colder inside than I expected, the temperature dropping even further as I closed the door behind me. The interior was even more run down than I remembered. The wood floors were covered in layers of dust, and the windows were streaked with grime. There was a small wood stove in the corner, but the chimney was clogged with debris, and it didn't look like it had been used in years. The only furnishings were an old cot in the far corner, a rickety wooden table, and a couple of chairs. Nothing in the cabin had been touched in ages. I went to check the small pantry built into the wall, finding only a few cans of expired food and some dry rations that had probably been left behind by another ranger. It wasn't much, but in an emergency, it would suffice. I began to check the structure of the cabin itself, making sure there were no leaks in the roof, no cracks in the walls, no signs of damage that could compromise the safety of anyone using the place. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle, like someone or something was just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement outside the cabin, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. When I looked, nothing was there. I dismissed it as nothing more than the wind or my nerves getting the better of me. But then, just as I was about to finish my inspection, I heard it. A low thump, followed by another, like something was knocking on the cabin door. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be the wind. It was coming from outside. My first instinct was to call out, but I stopped myself. There was no one around for miles. I would have heard a vehicle or someone approaching from a distance. Yet here I was, in the middle of the forest, with a thump, thump, thump echoing through the quiet. I slowly made my way to the door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound. There was nothing but silence. The wind had died down, and even the usual rustling of the trees had ceased. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside, but saw nothing. The trail leading up to the cabin was empty, just the same old path I had walked in on. I stepped outside, scanning the trees, the brush, and the forest floor, but it was as still as death. My breath hung in the air, faint clouds of condensation forming as I exhaled. I listened again, trying to catch any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I felt a chill down my spine, a sense of unease creeping in once more. I told myself to calm down, that I was just overthinking things. The forest played tricks on people, and the stillness was unnerving at times. I was alone, yes, but that didn't mean I was in danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stepped back into the cabin and locked the door behind me. I checked the windows, pulling the blinds down to obscure the view. It was silly, I thought, but I felt safer with them closed, even if it didn't make sense. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I finished my inspection and decided to spend the night in the cabin. I had packed enough supplies for a few days, and it would give me time to take care of some paperwork and maintenance reports. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. I stoked the small fire in the wood stove and settled into the cot in the corner of the cabin, trying to shake off the unease I had been feeling all day. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I listened to the wind howl outside, feeling the isolation weigh heavily on me. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. It was a slow, dragging sound, as if something was rubbing against the walls. I lay perfectly still, listening, my mind racing. The sound came again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was unmistakable now, and it was coming from the back of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, trying not to make a sound. My thoughts were scattered, my body tense with fear. What the hell was that? I tried to reason with myself, but fear kept gnawing at me. I grabbed my rifle from the corner, checking the chamber before moving to the back door. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but whatever it wasn't normal. The scraping continued, getting louder now, like something or someone was trying to claw their way into the cabin. I crept to the back window, carefully peering through the blinds. My flashlight swept over the scene outside, illuminating nothing but trees, rocks, and the dark shadows of the forest. No movement, nothing. The sound stopped suddenly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady my breathing, but there was no further noise. The rest of the night passed without incident. The scraping didn't return, and the wind eventually died down. The next morning, I packed up my gear and prepared to leave. The forest was calm once again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. As I made my way down the trail, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, old and weathered, but I couldn't help but feel like it was no longer just a building. It had become something else, something I couldn't explain. I didn't return to that cabin again. There was no reason to. The park was vast, and I had more pressing matters elsewhere. But every so often, I'd find myself walking past the northern sector, and I'd glance toward the thick woods, remembering the strange events that had unfolded. The cabin still stands, somewhere in the wilderness, waiting for the next ranger to inspect it. I've heard rumors from others who worked in that area. Strange noises, odd occurrences, a lingering sense of unease. They all say the same thing. It's not the same place it used to be. I don't know what's out there, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back.